Hello and welcome to week 4 of Game Design in the Forge, where we're gonna build some worlds. Now, world building is perhaps the most intense thing you could possibly do with your imagination, but it's so much fun because literally every detail about that world is up to you. But let's talk a little bit about how people interact with worlds and why. No doubt the most successful franchises over the past few decades are what we call Transmedia Worlds. And that term really just points to the fact that these worlds are accessible through a lot of different kinds of media. Through movies, through music, through comics, through games, through novels, through toys, through TV shows. As many inlets as possible. Let's take a look at one of the most successful examples of this from the 90s. No doubt you've heard of the world of Pokemon. What started as an exciting new Game Boy game grew into one of the biggest franchises in history. Now, the original game spent 5 years in development and was eventually released in 1996. And it was a hit. Not only did it popularize the Japanese animation style here in the West, but it had some intriguing new mechanics that weren't seen in other games before. At any rate, people couldn't get enough of it. And the creators of Pokemon seized that moment and created a TV show the very next year, 1997. So what this was really just more content for that world. People who loved the game now had another option of interacting with those characters. They could watch a story unfold for 30 minutes every Saturday morning. But why stop there, right? In 1999, the creators collaborated with the Wizards of the Coast and came out with the Pokemon trading card game. And boy, did that take off. I remember when that hit. Kids were bringing their Pokemon cards to school every day, trading and playing with each other. Everyone knew who Charizard was, who Blastoise was. Even people that didn't really play or weren't really into it. These were household names. So the strength of Pokemon is not just in the game itself, but it's in this very calculated use of multiple forms of media that all feed into this very well thought out world. Now let's look at another approach to this that occurred in the 70s and 80s. When George Lucas introduced Star Wars to the world, it exploded. Even just that first film was enough to produce all kinds of merchandise for it. Toys, lunchboxes, backpacks, clothing. Now, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that the production companies were just trying to capitalize off of something popular, right? And make an extra buck. I mean, those original action figures are cool, but they don't look that amazing. It's just cheap plastic at the end of the day. But whether it was just to make some more money or not, what George Lucas paid attention to is the way in which people interacted with that merchandise. Kids who had these action figures weren't necessarily just acting out scenes that they knew from the movie. They were coming up with whole new stories in which these characters were involved. And this is what led to the idea of the expanded universe. George Lucas more or less just gave free rein to the public to create anything they wanted to using the Star Wars name. Of course, George Lucas owned rights to anything that was ever created with the Star Wars name, but he basically just open sourced this universe to generate all kinds of stories with rich narratives and characters. All this material was moderated by Lucasfilm, and Lucasfilm reserved the right to draw from and contradict anything that was created by an outside person. But this is markedly different from the Pokemon approach, which took very calculated steps in building a world. But it also just got a lot of people excited about exploring this universe on their own. Now, I'm sure you can think of some pretty popular characters and stories, all of which are based on really rich worlds. Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Marvel, Dungeons and Dragons, Transformers, Star Trek, Star Wars, The Matrix, Pokemon, Dragon Ball Z. All of these things are fantastic worlds that people spend countless hours interacting with. But why? Some things that you'll notice about all of these transmedia worlds are, number one, that they're powerful. They often connect to specific types of people. They appeal and connect to that part of our personhood that looks for adventure and seeks anything out of the ordinary. In the same way that everyone experiences this world differently, people experience these other worlds differently too. They become a personal utopia for anyone that's in them. And because of this deep emotional connection they often provide, they end up being very long-lived. Powerful stories and characters can be carried through generations. I developed a love of Star Wars as a child, and I'm gonna pass that on to my kids. And maybe they'll pass it on to theirs. And that's the last really important thing to notice about these kinds of worlds, is that they can evolve over long periods of time. They have to be able to grow and change. While those things are some good high-level commonalities with transmedia worlds, let's talk a little bit more detailed about what they have in common. First off, strong worlds are really rooted in their original medium. Star Wars was a movie. Pokemon was a game. Lord of the Rings was a book. Being true to the original medium as your world expands and grows into other mediums is very, very important. That original inlet is the source, the seed from which everything else grows. And you can't betray that. Number 2, they're intuitive. There are some things that we should expect to know how to do once we step into these fantasy worlds. And often this intuition comes from a reflection in our own real world here. Because anyone stepping into your world for the first time, they gotta be able to use some of the skills or intuition they already have to move around in that world. Number 3, they tend to have a creative individual at their core. Now this isn't a hard, fast rule, but most of these worlds came from a single mind. Star Wars, George Lucas. Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling. Marvel, Stan Lee. Now of course these people had tons and tons of other people help them bring their vision to life, right? But if those individuals were to include everyone's opinions on what this world should be, that can get convoluted really quickly. Now this is a really tough pill for some people to swallow, but if you can see that someone has a really clear, well thought out vision and they're able to explain that vision to you in a way that makes sense, you really have to just set aside your ego and say, hey, let's spend more time in this world. I want to help you build that. And if you're the person with a vision, it's really incumbent upon you to explain and bring other people into that world in a way that gets them excited. Number 4, these worlds are story machines. There can be no end to the amount of stories that can take place in this world. And with good characters and situations, these stories should be able to grow and interconnect. Now, a lot of those stories and characters have been around for a long time, but there is no end to the stories that can be told in that universe. It will go on and on and on. Number 5 is that they have to make sense through any of the inlets that you provide. Once you start branching out from that original medium, again, you have to stay true to it. You can't deviate from that original idea. Think about how well the Pokemon trading card game closely mimicked the actual video game. You were a trainer and you had your deck of Pokemon cards and you could battle against other trainers and capture their Pokemon and add them to the deck or trade Pokemon. The trading card game stayed true to the original idea in the video game. If the trading card game used some other completely off-balance mechanic that didn't tie into that original idea, it wouldn't have been as successful or strong. Number 6 is the importance of discovery. Now let's use the good old tabletop RPG Dungeons & Dragons to illustrate this point. Dungeons & Dragons is all about a group of people discovering a world together. Now this path to discovery and story is led by someone called the Dungeon Master. Those players in that player group are really free to explore any part of this world that they want. Sometimes they come across things that the Dungeon Master expects. Sometimes they trip upon whole new situations and stories. That's when things get tough for the Dungeon Master. They really have to think on their toes. But you see this in all these other worlds as well. I mean, no doubt there's a wiki page for each one of these worlds where people spend countless hours researching and finding out about history, looking at relationships between characters and events, because people just want to know more and more about these worlds, so there has to be things for them to discover. And lastly, number 7, all of these worlds provide some kind of wish fulfillment for the people that visit them. I can't tell you how badly I wanted to be a Jedi when I was a little kid. I still do. Or how much I wanted to soar on the backs of giant eagles with Gandalf. Or enter the Matrix and fight machines with Neo. All of these worlds provide a way to experience a life outside of your own, which once you bring it back around can actually do a lot for your interactions in the real world. Stepping into a role and caring about someone else's plight is empathy. And entering into these worlds can be a good practice of empathy. Now, there's one last thing I want to talk about when it comes to interacting with these fantasy worlds, and that's the idea of escapism versus criticism. Now, this is a very tough line to walk, and I'm not saying that you should always be in the middle or always be on one side or the other, but it is important to be aware of where you are on that scale. Whenever you interact with the world, you could be doing it just to escape this reality. That probably happens more often than not. More people go and see a Marvel movie, or more people jump into their World of Warcraft character just to forget all the pressures of our own reality, right? Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, that's needed sometimes, but if that's the only way that you ever interact with these worlds, then that becomes a problem. Step into the other side of the scale, criticism. Being critical while you're in these worlds is remaining conscious while you're in them. You're more of an observer than you are a participant. Now this is important because in this way you can see the flaws, or see what things can be improved, or see what's missing so that you can create more content. On the other side, if you're escaping, then you're really just there for the experience, getting lost in your character, so to speak. So if you want to be a game designer, it's important for you to be able to do both of these things. Because if all you do is escape, you'll never generate enough content to make your world interesting. And if all you do is criticize, you'll never know what it's like to really experience that world. Consequently, you'll probably get bored with it, and again, not generate any content. Perhaps what's most important to realize is that these transmedia worlds are quickly becoming the new standard for entertainment. With the demand for content, it's not going to be acceptable anymore to just focus on one particular medium for a story. If you're going to create a world that you want people to interact with, then you have to give him as many different possibilities to interact with that world as you can. Thanks for joining me for this great talk about world building, and we'll see you in the Forge.